Καλησπέρα σας. Καλώς ήρθατε στο Καναδικό Ινστιτούτο. Very happy to have you all here. I just came back from Canada yesterday, so it's not that I'm jet lagged, but I have all these curious names, to pronounce, and I have a bit of sometimes difficulty with this, and so bear with me a bit. I'm very happy to have with us this evening Adam Wiznura. He said, okay. Adam is our fellow, is the Institute, Canadian Institute Fellow for this year. He's from Alberta, from a Ukrainian family. That's with a Wiznura, I think. He did his MA and BA and MA at the University of Alberta with our colleague Margaret Hagsma, which is not Ukrainian. Margaret, she's Dutch. And he is finishing his PhD now at the University of Groningen. I like to say. At the University of Groningen. In ancient history at the University of Groningen, yes, and his PhD is entitled Connecting the Greeks, Regional Festival Networks in Hellenistic and Roman Thessaly. His PhD research forms part of Groningen's collaborative project on Greek festivals called Connecting the Greeks, Multi-Scholar Festivals in the Hellenistic World, which is led by Ono van Knife. Is he in the room? Is this? I'm sorry. and Christina Williamson. Adam also worked on several archaeological projects, including the Central Achaia Phthiotis survey with Margaret Hagsma, the Castro Calitheia archaeological project, the Agios Vasilios survey project, and the Halos excavations, working primarily as a classical Roman pottery specialist. He has an article that came out, Mountains of Memory, and he's a very nice guy, very good scholar, and so I'm happy to have him take the podium now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jacques. Bear with me for a second. Apparently we have two PowerPoints showing online, so I'm going to try to fix that. Is that better, Jonathan? Okay, well, I'll keep talking and let me know. Okay. So I would like to start off by thanking the CIG and the Elisabeth Alföldi-Rosenbaum Fellowship for allowing me to be in Greece doing this research. This paper today is based on some of the final case studies of my dissertation, focusing on a wider Panhellenic scope. And I emphasize final parts of my dissertation, so my supervisor won't get too mad sitting over there. So to begin the paper, festivals of all types, including agonistic, otherwise known as athletic, festivals, contribute to a sense of belonging and identity at a local level and are a way of creating connectivity at a regional and trans-regional level. The connectivity between people in Thessaly is sometimes more complex than in other regions due to geographical separation and constant political struggles between the tetrads and perioikoi, which I will discuss a little bit in a bit. This complexity leads us to question how much of a Thessalian identity there actually was. Through this lecture, I hope to demonstrate that in the region of Thessaly, festivals were a core element of social cohesion, fostering local and interregional relationships, and will also illustrate the changing patterns we see of Thessalian participation in Panhellenic festivals, as well as with the rise of festival culture and what this means. So I'll begin by first discussing some of the religious history among the Tetrads and Perioikoi to explain how the identifications of communities tended to shift in and out of Thessalian affiliation. And this will provide a background for the case studies that I will continue with on the Olympics, the Aetonia Festival, the Thessalian Olympia, and the Eleftheria Festival. I will wrap up by discussing the trends we see, why this may be the case, and what it means in terms of Thessalian identity. So very briefly, I just want to define what I mean by the region of Thessaly. Thessaly is often referred to in modern scholarship as a unified singular entity. However, such a definition is problematic, as Thessaly can refer to any number of different territories and histories. So tetradic Thessaly constitutes primarily of two centrally enclosed plains, which were eventually divided into 4 tetrads or quadrants. So that's this area here. And the 4 tetrads which were formed were Hestiaiotis in the northwest, Pelasgiotis in the northeast, Theotis in the southeast, and Thessaliotis in the southwest. The important thing to consider with tetradic Thessaly is that it was primarily inhabited by a population that actually identified as Thessalian. There were, however, other populations in the region who did not identify as Thessalian and were most likely people that lived in the area before the arrival of Thessalians. So these include populations like the Lapiths, Magnesians, and Achaeans. Perioikic Thessaly refers not only to the plains of tetradic Thessaly, but also to the surrounding mountainous regions. So these include the areas of Parabia to the north, Magnesia to the east, Achaia Theotis to the southeast, and Dolopia to the southwest. And so these areas, through evidence, suggest that they did not actually identify themselves as Thessalian and were not identified by prehistoric Hellenistic sources as Thessalian. A major political watershed that permeated all aspects of society, including religious life in Thessaly, was the creation of the formal Thessalian League in 196 BCE. By Quintus Flamininus, which saw the gradual political and religious assimilation of most Perioikoi into a unified Thessaly in the early 2nd century BCE. One of the most instrumental policies in coordinating and communicating communal Thessalian values of the new league was the creation of a central religious calendar and the establishment of federal festivals in central places such as the Eleftheria in Larissa and the Aetonia in Thessaliotis, which became internationally renowned over time, and which I will get to in my upcoming case studies. Month names would have corresponded to a particular festival held during the month that would have been common knowledge to all people in that particular area. The calendar before the formation of the Thessalian koinon is much more unclear, as individual Perioikoi appear to have had their own local calendars and therefore various different festivals. This shared Thessalian calendar began, it appears, by synchronizing months from the calendars of the tetrads, as it took time for this shared calendar to become adopted by the Perioikoi. Even after the Perioikoi politically joined the Thessalian League, local calendars continue to be in use for some time. Pan-Thessalian festivals, however, become more recognized over this time, as other festivals appeared that had travelers from other parts of Thessaly. All of this is to say that even within the region, different areas didn't necessarily want to participate in the same festivals. While I'm on this slide, I do want to take the opportunity to briefly discuss some of the methodology that I use in my research, and that is with network theory. As I'm sure some of you have been looking at the network on the map on the left here. So network theory, in its simplest definition, is a way to study the movement of peoples, analyzing the connections that people make between, in my case, cities and regions, as well as people that come from other parts of the Mediterranean world. So in my case, I use predominantly festivals, sanctuaries, or here, different city names. So you have, in this case, Magnesian League, Lamia, Hippota, for example, as well as the links with them are the calendar names. And so you have calendar names like Hippodromios, which is shared by Aquinos, Lamia, and the Thessalian League. And so just a very brief way of talking about kind of how network theory functions, how I use it in my research, and how I will talk about it as this presentation goes on. So before delving into the case studies, I just want to very quickly discuss the sources that I look at. So not surprisingly, the majority of the material comes from epigraphic evidence, predominantly from victors' lists. However, I also do look at some archaeological evidence, in particular theaters. I would like to look at gymnasia, but as far as I'm aware, archaeologically, there's no gymnasia found in Thessaly to this date. So before delving into the case studies, I do want to very briefly discuss kind of these maps, which are kind of a central premise, as it does provide an idea of what the geographical layout of festivals and festival architecture is like in broader Thessaly. So here we can see the map of where the regional festivals of Thessaly are kind of spread out. And again, this is post 3rd century BC. Sorry, I don't have the date on there. Here we have gymnasia in Thessaly, and again, none of these are archaeologically attested, so all of our evidence from gymnasia come from various inscriptions and epigraphic contexts, a lot of the times only mentioning a gymnasiarch as opposed to a solid gymnasium. And then finally, we have theaters in Thessaly, and for anybody in this room who knows Thessaly, you know that that is way too many theaters based on what we actually see in person, as there are only 4 archaeologically attested festival theaters, and that is in Larissa, Theotic Thebes, Demetrius, and 2 in Larissa. However, recently, the excavation team at Pellena has said that they have found a new theater, so I am excited to see how that looks. The rest of the theaters on here are all based on either written sources, epigraphic contexts, or in the case of a lot of Western Thessaly, based on some of the archaeologists' theories about where a theater might be, and there's not a whole lot of evidence. So in my dissertation, I do actually place a caveat on that. So festivals during the Hellenistic period in the wider Mediterranean began to flourish, with every region seemingly instituting new festivals as well as attempting to legitimize them as Panhellenic events. Agonistic festivals became such an important event during this period that there were now full-time athletes who traveled from festival to gain notoriety. The Thessalians were not exempt to this, as they also traveled to festivals to compete, especially when it came to important festivals like the Olympics. And here I will do a shameless plug for the wider PhD project research group co-directed by Onno and my other supervisor, Christina, which brought together a database of all known Hellenistic athletic victories in the Mediterranean. And you can view that at connectedcontest.org. So if you have any interest in athletic participation or want to view anything with networks and athletes, please do visit that. So what we know, basically with these maps, it's a matter of exporting the data from the website, and you can view how Olympic victors were from in the Archaic and Classical periods, as well as the Hellenistic and Imperial periods. And what you can notice through these maps right away is by the Hellenistic period, we see a large explosion of competitors in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, particularly in Asia Minor. So to shift back to how do Thessalian participation look like in the Olympics. So although there's not a significant amount of participation in the Olympics, there is relatively constant participation from Thessalians, amassing a total of 31 victories. The first victory being Craxidus, or Craxilus of Cranon, who won at the inauguration of the Kellis Telios event, an equestrian event, in 648 BCE. Now, there is a preconceived notion that because Thessaly was renowned for its horses, that they would have been highly competitive at equestrian events at various agonistic games. This, however, does not seem to be the case with the Thessalians, as the Thessalians account for only 7% of the total number of known hippic victories across the Crown Games. So this is including the Olympics, but as well as the Pythian, Nemean, and Isthmian Games. At the Olympics particularly, what we see is that out of 31 total victories, only 13 were hippic, with the rest being in running and combat sport events. These numbers, however, do not paint the full picture of the changes that we actually see in Thessalian participation. So here's a breakdown of the events, and we see equestrian and running events fairly comparable. However, so you can see here, running, equestrian are kind of split half and half with a bit of combat sports. But when we move to the Archaic and Classical periods, what we see is that Thessalian victories were predominantly running, with 13 victories, with only 5 hippic victories and 4 combat sport victories. And then when we start shifting to the Hellenistic period, we do notice a great shift, as suddenly we get a wide majority of equestrian victories with a singular running victory. But I will emphasize that with this chart, this is only a counting of 9 total victories by Thessalians in this period. So, I mean, even though it is a wide majority of equestrian victors, it still only accounts for 8 total equestrian victories. So again, if we look at the picture in the Archaic and Classical periods, what we see is that 22 total victories from a variety of poleis in Thessaly, with Pharsalus and Larissa being dominant. So what then is the change that we may see based on these 9 Hippic victories in the Hellenistic period is that all of a sudden they predominantly are only won by people who are labeled as Thessalian. And unlike in the pre-3rd century, where a lot of the Thessalian victories come from fragmentary inscriptions where they may have been from a polis, in these ones, they are all just listed as a person from Thessaly. So rather than mentioning their particular polis, they're just wanting to more regionalize themselves. And this is something that I will continuously talk about throughout this presentation, but for now I will shift the focus a little bit back to Thessaly and what we're seeing with Panhellenic festivals arising in the region. Maybe? Okay. So when we look at Thessaly in the Archaic and Classical periods, what we see are a very small number of festivals. And when it comes to the festivals at Aitonos, this was not an agonistic festival, so what we're seeing is that there's almost no athletic festivals occurring in Thessaly prior to the 3rd century BC. During the Hellenistic period, as with the rest of the Mediterranean, what we see is a drastic rise in the festivals in Thessaly, as well as architecture related to agonistic festivals, as most of the theaters in Thessaly were built, or at least added to, during the Hellenistic period. And at least with these ones, we now have a lot more athletic events. So at Pellena, Larissa, Pharsalos, Thebes, and Demetrius, all of these ones are athletic spaces. And so with this, I will start with my 3 case studies in Thessaly, starting with, if this thing will change. Okay, Aitonos, the Thessalian Olympia up top, and with the Eleftheria in Larissa. So the first case study on the Aetonia festival. The cult of Athena Aetonia is generally thought of as the oldest and most important festival in Thessaly, predating the supposed arrival of the Thessalians as far back as the early Iron Age. Nilsson early on suggests that Athena Aetonia was a syncretized goddess between Athena and a local deity Aetonia. So Aetonia would have been in connection to a city of Aiton or Aitonos. And in Homer's catalog of ships, it does mention Aiton, mother of flocks. That was part of Protesilaus' territory. Whereas Strabo mentions that an Aitonos was located 60 stadia from Halos, and that there was a temple of the Aetonia nearby. This has created a lot of debate among scholars concerning the actual location of Aiton, Aitonos, and the sanctuary of Athena Aetonia, which later becomes a trans-regional sanctuary. Based on a passage of Strabo, which indicates the city Aitonos was located by the Quarios River in Thessaliotis, over here, William Leake began thinking of the possibility of Aitonos being located around Kyrion and Arne in Thessaliotis, and this was further built on by Kianopoulos in the 1920s, who, while traveling in the area of Philia, found an inscription attributed to the Thessalian League and a number of bronze horses. The inscription is extremely fragmented, and the only preserved line mentions Koinon Thessalon. However, nothing was excavated at the site for a number of years. Theocharis in the 1960s was alerted to looting at a farm after the farmer had plowed the area, uncovering a bunch of bronze finds and building remains. Theocharis excavated a large part of the sanctuary as part of a rescue excavation, but aside from the initial archaeological reports, very little has actually been published on this site. until recently when Hillian Durlemeyer published all of the metal finds, and in the last decade excavations have continued by Karagianopoulos and Paleothoros, and currently Katerina Ragu is conducting a survey of the wider area around the sanctuary, although she is focusing more on the later Byzantine phase. And here is the only plan of the site that has so far been produced, where really we only see the fragment of the basilica that was built over the site. So again, it would be wonderful if excavation work could be done there. The early stages of the sanctuary are a little unclear, but it appears that the sanctuary by Philia was more than just a local sanctuary. Although there is a vast number of votive offerings dating to the Archaic period, there is no clear-cut evidence to suggest it was a sanctuary of the Thessalian ethnos, at least in the earlier period. The earliest inscription from the site, dating to the end of the 3rd century BC, is not a federal decree, nor does it in any way claim to represent the ethnos of the Thessalians. The inscription is superpolis, but sub-ethnos as it attests to the establishment of Sympoliteia between Thymae and Metropolis, 2 ancient cities in the immediate area around Philia. However, around this same time period, at the end of the 3rd century BC, another inscription was discovered that discusses the Thessalian Olympia on Mount Olympus and suggests a decree will be set up in Aitenos, and I will talk about that in the following case study. So I do want to emphasize, however, that although this indicates that the Thessalians were aware of the sanctuary at Aitenos, it still does not provide certain evidence that this sanctuary was attended by people from all over Thessaly. So we know for certain that with the creation of the Thessalian League, Athena Aetonia was named one of the 2 main deities, along with Zeus Eleftherios. And with this, decrees were set up in the sanctuary of Aetonia at Philia and in the sanctuary of Zeus Eleftherios and Larissa. One of the first inscriptions suggesting this is a 2nd century BC inscription inviting Imbracians to the festival of Athena Aetonia, which was inscribed on behalf of the Thessalian League. And so that is this one here, SEG 26688. So this inscription concerns Imbracians and is important for a few reasons. First of which is that it positively identifies this sanctuary of Philia as a sanctuary of Athena Aetonia and an important sanctuary to the Thessalians as a whole. No worries. And the koinon of the Thessalians is mentioned in this inscription. So the inscription also indicates a jointly held sacrifice, which could be a part of the festival of the Aetonia, which is important as Imbracians attending the festival would indicate that this was a transregional event. This does not indicate that people from outside of Thessaly were attending this. This does indicate, that people from outside of Thessaly were attending the sanctuary, which clearly had high importance for the Thessalians. And this inscription dates to the 2nd century BC, again, which indicates that which is after the foundation of the Thessalian League, indicating that it was part of the Federal League. The second inscription here, IG 12-41133, concerns the Coan interest in the sanctuary and dates to around 294 BCE. As a result of the Thessalians supposedly aiding the Coans, who had a grain shortage and suffered a great period of famine, the Coans honored the Thessalians with a gold crown, and this inscription was to be set up in the sanctuary of Athena Aetonia. This inscription also dates a century earlier than the implementation of the Thessalian koinon, which does raise an issue as to who the Thessalians in the inscription are actually referring to. Presumably, the Thessalians is referring to Larissa and possibly other cities in the Tetrads, but it is unlikely the Coans are honoring all of the Perioikoi at this time, as the Perioikoi did not identify themselves as Thessalian. It's also unknown that if everyone from around broader Thessaly was actively involved in this particular cult of Athena Aetonia, as there is evidence of worship of Athena Aetonia as a local deity in various Tetrads and Perioikoi. So with this, I'll move on to the next case study of the Thessalian Olympia. A sanctuary existed at the peak of Agios Antonios on Mount Olympus, which is today in the region of central Macedonia, only 45 meters away from the border with Thessaly, but was in antiquity at a neutral border region between Thessaly and Macedonia. Agios Antonios, at 2,800 meters above sea level, is the 4th highest peak on Olympus's 52 peaks. During the building of a meteorological station in 1961, fragments of ancient material began to turn up, and so rescue excavations had to be conducted prior to construction. The excavators unearthed a thick deposit of burned earth containing a great number of burnt ovocaprid bones, pottery, coins, and fragments of statuary. Fragments from 9 stelae were found, 3 of which were inscribed to Zeus Olympios, 2 dating to the Hellenistic period and 1 to the imperial period. And similarly to the last sanctuary, this is the only site plan that we have for the site. So the most likely interpretation for the site at Agios Antonios is that it served as an ash altar, similar to places like Mount Lycaon. Thus, it is important to consider what purpose this particular sanctuary to Zeus Olympios served in this particular peak, in this particular region, and by whom it was built. A 3rd century BC inscription, and don't worry, I'll give a Cliff Notes version in English on the next slide, comes from Aeolian Agai in Anatolia, referencing a sanctuary and festival to Zeus Olympios on Mount Olympus. The inscription was written on a stone stele excavated in 2004, and it was written in the Larissan dialect of Thessaly and probably dates to the second half of the 3rd century BC, and that's based on the dialect, the lettering, and the content. So there's much information to gain from this inscription with regards to the festival, but for the context of this paper, I will emphasize 2 points. The inscription states that copies of this decree will be set up in Iton, probably referring to the sanctuary at Athena, Itonia, and Philia, in Larissa, at the sanctuary of Apollo-Kurdios, a purely local sanctuary of the city, and at the Olympion, the sanctuary of Zeus on Olympus. Of these 3 sanctuaries, where the inscription is to be set up, both the Iton sanctuary and Olympion were most likely Pan-Thessalian sites, while, as I mentioned, Apollo-Kurdios is the only local sanctuary. The other lines to emphasize are the final lines listing the Tagoi, all located in Larissa, and I realize I don't have that on this slide, so that's this part here, which mentions the Tagoi of Larissa in the Thessalian dialect, and then lists off a series of Tagoi. So these lines, I believe, are important, as the general tone of the inscription suggests that it is Thessalians decreeing this. At this time, there was no formal Thessalian league, and to my knowledge, this is the only inscription from the 3rd century that references the Thessalians as a group, as opposed to naming themselves as individual tetrads or perioikoi, but please, if anybody knows of others, please let me know. So this by itself is important. However, the lines near the end of the inscription greatly suggest that Larissa was in charge of what was happening at this sanctuary. Although the sanctuary arguably was administered by Larissa, the sanctuary itself seems to have been one that everyone from Thessaly would have known about and come to, based not just on inscriptions, but by the activity from the sanctuary. That, plus the fact that Mount Olympus was such a dominant force in the Thessalian landscape, indicates a more Thessalian connection as opposed to a strictly civic one. One might argue, and I'm sure some of you are wondering, how the 4th highest peak on Olympus is not exactly conducive for hosting any form of agonistic events. So although Olympus is the highest mountain in Greece, it's not necessarily the most difficult hike, but it is icy and steep all year round, and it's definitely not easy to turn into an Olympic venue, given the required effort to transport large number of people, animals, and supplies up a mountain. So the finds from Agios Antonios also support this, as there is no evidence of large amounts of visitors of agonistic venues, and there's no post-agonistic dedications. However, the Olympion in the inscription was not specified as the venue for these games, only as the site for a joint sacrifice between the Thessalians, the Aeolians, the Coans, and the Magnesians on the Meander. The sacrifice took place on Agios Antonios, but the events probably took place in the plains and the cities where there were already agonistic facilities and amenities, so presumably at Larissa. Zeus's altar merely loomed high over the plains, presiding over the festival. And here's my second shameless plug of the talk. For those interested, myself and Gino Canlas will be publishing a paper on the cult of Zeus Olympios in our co-edited volume, Insiders and Outsiders in Ancient Thessaly, which will hopefully come out early next year, which will discuss more about intersections between foreign and local in Thessaly. And so this brings us to the final case study on the Eleftheria festival held in Larissa. And this is probably the most well-known festival that people have heard about. This festival has the largest amount of surviving epigraphic evidence about victors and events from the festival. This festival was held in honor of Zeus Eleftherios and was established after 196 BCE as a result of the removal of Macedonian hegemony over Thessaly by the Romans to honor the liberation of the people. It was at this time also that Flamininus created the first historical attestation of a formal Thessalian league, uniting politically the Tetrads and the Perioikoi of Thessaly. So the cult of Zeus Eleftherios became an important cult during the Thessalian League, as the official decrees of the league were placed at the sanctuaries of Athena Itonia at Philia and of Zeus Eleftherios and Larissa, suggesting both cults were administered by the Thessalian League and were pan-Thessalian. The cult of Zeus Eleftherios possibly replaced the cult of Zeus Olympios, as after the implementation of the Eleftheria, there ceases to be any form of, well, at least there's no evidence on the Zeus Olympios sanctuary, aside from one singular inscription from the Roman period. So this location of the sanctuary for Zeus Eleftherios is unknown, although Theophilus suggests that it may have been located in the Agora of Larissa. This new Eleftheria festival was most likely Pentateric and developed into a Panhellenic festival. The earliest attested inscriptions for the festival is from 184-3 BCE, honoring Nicostratus of Larissa at the Amphictyonic Council, with later inscriptions suggesting the festival continued until at least 100 CE, if not later. Based on the surviving epigraphic evidence, little is known about matters of sacrifice or the processions of the festival, but we do have a rough idea about the organization of events in the games, as well as certain dating characteristics in the inscriptions. The general format of events was similar to other festivals in the Greek world, with melic, gymnic, and equestrian contests, but the Eleftheria also include a series of events referred to in modernity as the Thessalian Triad, which I believe Denver Groninger first mentioned, though, I mean, I guess he can tell us that after, which consisted of Toratheria, Aphippolampus, and Aphippodromos. So here you can see a few of these victor lists and inscriptions. I will discuss them as I go through this following section. So the Thessalian Triad events were all primarily Thessalian, with little attestation outside of Thessaly. The Toratheria was a contest where athletes most likely chased bulls, but it is unclear what happened in these contests. In some later inscriptions, the word Toracathapsia is mentioned in terms of bull hunting for this event, so it is possible that some combination of this occurred at the Eleftheria. This event was very important to the Thessalians and is represented on coins all over Thessaly throughout the Hellenistic period. And here you can see two coin depictions. Here is a depiction of the Toratheria, so here is a person wrestling with a bull, and then a horse on the obverse side. So Aphippolampus is unattested outside of Thessaly except for a description in Plato's Republic, referring to a torchlight race at night on horseback. However, whether or not this happened at the Eleftheria is unknown. Lastly, the Aphippodromos, up here, is even more complicated and mysterious. This event is possibly depicted on coins and appears to show an individual running alongside a horse holding the reins, which you can kind of see here. It has been suggested that this event relates to Apobatikoi, which involves the dismounting and remounting of a horse by a rider. The melic contests were most likely held in one of the two theaters in Larissa, but the venues for the other events of the festival, like the gymnasium, stadium, hippodrome, have not been found. Theophilus suggests that the gymnasium could have been located along the Pineos River, outside of the city walls to allow for ample water, as well as a possible second smaller gymnasium located by the Free Agora. The hippodrome, he suggests, was located near the gymnasium, while the stadium is unknown, but probably in the city walls somewhere. So these fragmentary inscriptions for the festival can be dated in two groups, from 196 BCE to around 150 BCE, and another set of inscriptions from around 100 BCE to 50 BC. And here I kind of gave two examples. So these is from the earlier set of inscriptions, and this is from the later set of inscriptions. So the earlier inscriptions only mention an agonothete for dating purposes. As you can see here, the agonothete of the Thessalians, Androsthenes, son of Italos of Girtion, and then it goes right into the list of victors. whereas the later inscriptions also mention a priest of Zeus Eleftherios. So the priest of Zeus Eleftherios was son of Cleonicus of Larissa, before moving into the victors' lists. A second difference that we see between these is that in the earlier inscriptions, individuals from Larissa are listed as Nostratus, the Thessalian from Larissa, while as in the later forms we see Thessalians from Larissa in Pelasgiotis, and this has to do with the formation of Larissa Crimiste and Achaia Theotis during the later period. And so these Larissans wanted to differentiate themselves from those ones. So lastly, the earlier victors' lists go from Melik, so you can see Salpistus, Aulos, Kythera, before moving into the gymnic events, so Pentathlon, and then this inscription is fragmentary, but presumably there would have been hippic events afterwards. And then the later inscriptions have the Thessalian triad right after these Melik events, and then you get into Torephteria, Phippolampos, Phippodromos, before moving into the gymnic events. Denver Groninger suggests that the Thessalian triad may not have been part of the earlier version of the Eleftheria, and I do tend to agree with this, as the Thessalian triad only began to appear in inscriptions after the implementation of a more local festival in Larissa, which is in honor of those who fell at the Battle of the Stena. And this festival that appears after, I believe, 172 BCE, after that festival that you start seeing this Thessalian triad appear in the Eleftheria inscriptions, and so it's quite reasonable to assume that the Thessalian triad just weren't included in the earlier ones. So what I also want to briefly mention is how the equestrian victories look, seeing as that at the Olympics there seems to be a dramatic rise in equestrian victories in the Hellenistic period. So at the Eleftheria, what we see is that from the surviving evidence, only Thessalians are listed as hippic victors, with it mainly being people from Larissa winning. With regards to the Thessalian triad again, we only have Thessalian victors. So does this mean that outsiders did not participate in these events, or were the Thessalians just seemingly better? This is a difficult question to answer, given the lack of evidence, but a suggestion can be made made from the Thessalians who were victorious in these events. So many victors in these events were high-ranking and had strong connections to the generals of the Thessalian League. Theodoros from Atrax, who was a victor in the Kelis Teleos, Clearchos from Larissa, a victor again in the Kelis Teleos, and Petreos from Girton, a victor in Phippolampos, were actually generals in the Thessalian League at different times. So these were not just ordinary Thessalians who were winning these equestrian events. They were people with high standing who had greater resources and availability of the best horses. Petreos from Girton is a particularly interesting person to have won, as he is the only Thessalian victor at an equestrian event who is not from the actual tetrads. So this can partially be explained, as by this time Parabia had been fully incorporated into the Thessalian League, and appears to have also adopted the common Thessalian calendar, which is not something the other Perioikoi did as quickly as Parabia. Before the incorporation of the Perioikoi into the Thessalian League, these areas were seen as dependents of the tetrads, and they paid tribute to the tetrads. Most likely, they did not have the same wealth as the rest of these cities in the tetrads. So this could influence what we see in the Eleftheria, as the Perioikoi would not have had the same financial resources as Larissa and places like Pherae. This, however, does not account for the lack of victors from territories outside of Thessaly, as other areas participated in equestrian events at festivals, and as we saw at the Olympics, a large number of people that weren't Thessalian were actually winning the equestrian events. So the answer to the lack of victors outside of Thessaly may simply be that Thessalians were deciding to use all of their resources into these equestrian athletes in order to show themselves as superior to everyone else at their own regional games. In terms of the Thessalian triad of events, I believe that it might have only been that Thessalians were the only ones allowed to compete in these, as they were much more regional events, and we do not see them much elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. Torephteria gets moved over to Rome by the 2nd century CE, I believe, but that's much later on. And so regardless of the reasons why there are only Thessalian victors in these events, it is clear that there was some sort of push by the Thessalians to appear superior in these equestrian events. So now that I've discussed the Thessalians competing in the Olympics and some of the new Panhellenic festivals appearing in Thessaly, we have to ask ourselves if certain political conditions may have prompted the shift away from competing at Panhellenic games, such as the Olympics and the other crown games, and towards festivals held in a more regional context. First, I'll discuss the political climate during the 3rd century BCE. So in 352 BCE, Philip II of Macedon established its hegemony over Thessaly. Macedonian control over Thessaly was further solidified during the 3rd century, starting with their foundation of the city of Demetrius, which involved mass deportations of Thessalian Magnesian populations into a singular port city, which quickly grew to become a highly cosmopolitan polis. In the second half of the 3rd century, the Macedonians had fully removed all of the perioikoi from Thessalians' political control and had made many reforms on local political systems. Outside of Thessaly, festivals during the Hellenistic period in the wider Mediterranean began to flourish, with every region seemingly instituting new festivals, as well as attempting to legitimize them as Panhellenic events. Agonistic festivals became such an important thing during this time period, as I mentioned, that full-time athletes were traveling from festival to festival. But what was going on in the 3rd century from the Thessalian perspective? At the Panhellenic Games at Olympia in Elis, Thessaly's participation peaked in the 3rd century, and by the end of that century, Thessalian participation at the Peloponnesian Olympics had dropped significantly. But when Thessalian participation in Panhellenic festivals began to drop, Thessaly, similar to the rest of the Mediterranean, begins to institute many new regional festivals for themselves, and these festivals seem to have been a way for the Thessalians to maintain their own local identities during a time when they had largely lost a lot of their autonomy. Thessaly seems to have been turning more inward. The 3rd century inscriptions from the Peloponnesian Olympic Games ceased to identify Thessalian victors by their various poles and by their ethnos, Thessaly. Within Thessaly, mythical genealogies were manipulated to bypass a Heraclid ancestry, or so to say, the descent from the invaders of the region, which is how they commonly were known, and form a stronger connection to the pre-Thessalian Thessalians. So these are the inhabitants of the region before the descendants of Heracles. They instead seem to be wanting to promote their descent from the Aeolians, who were seen as the pre-Greek autochthonous inhabitants of Thessaly, such as the Pelasgians. They were, and I do have a slide, I believe, that I hid, so I'll show that after the presentation, if anybody's interested on this mythical genealogy tree. But basically, what I'm getting at is that the Thessalians were attempting to replace an invader narrative with a narrative of indigeneity. At a time when Thessaly's territorial sovereignty was threatened, the Thessalians began to look inward, becoming more regionalistic and starting to restrict their international networks. This resistance to Panhellenism was triggered by Macedonian occupation of Thessaly, the new globalized world that it was bringing to Thessaly, and the territorial uncertainty that Macedonian hegemony ultimately brought. The case studies I have presented on the Olympic Games, Itonia Festival, Thessalian Olympics, and the Eleftheria Festival demonstrate Thessalian resistance to certain aspects of Panhellenism, but at the same time, their newly restricted networks provide new opportunities for them to expand their international relations. Thank you, and here again are our project websites if anybody is interested.
Thank you, Helen, for your introduction to the world of Thessalian festivals. We have the microphone here. If there are questions from the audience, I had maybe to open a bit I wanted to ask you a question on you had a map at the beginning of all these cities in Thessaly which organized, which had festivals, eh?
Yes.
And is that compared to other,
This isn't working anymore.
to other, no, not that one, but at the very beginning, yeah, anyhow. I was just wondering because there's quite a few.
Yeah.
And if you compare this to other regions of Greece, what is the, is this, what, are there more in this region than elsewhere, or is it like this everywhere in Greece?
No, so as I'm trying to go back to it eventually. What we actually see is, I believe in Thessaly, we actually have a significant amount. We have less agonistic festivals appearing in the region. So although there are still a number of festivals presumably associated with sanctuaries, Gino Canlis's forthcoming book will show that I believe there's 105 different sanctuaries in Thessaly at this point, all presumably associated with, yeah, let me just move it on that one. This
Yeah.
oh, you exited the PowerPoint, I think.
Oh, I did.
Yeah. It should be that one, I think. Yeah, we'll do this. Yeah, there, that works. Yeah, so basically the ones that I plot are ones that are either agonistic or monumental enough that they have some type of significance to, at least this map is showing a lot more of the regional based festivals. So, no, it's okay. So one's up in Orthe has to do with a festival called the Petrea, which was, or Petrea and Peloria festivals, which were a pre-3rd century, and these ones would have been agonistic. A lot of these other ones are Sanctuary of Zeus Acreos has to do with the festival is purely a Magnesian festival. So basically the ones that I've chosen to do are, for this map, I have a complete list in my dissertation that will be finished soon. Yes, Anno, I promise. And so these ones here were predominantly the larger festivals that I decided to promote that have not quite a trans-regional approach, but are at least a little bit more than local, to say. So.
Thank you. We have a. I'll let you go there.
Thank you. I wonder if I could follow up about these festivals that we've just been talking about. So, are these festivals with where you have known victors, where the victors are all coming from Thessaly? Or are you getting victors from beyond Thessaly with these festivals that you're showing there on your post-3rd century ones?
So for these festivals here, so the only ones that we see from people outside of Thessaly are at Larissa, in particular the Eleftheria festival and their local stena. It's purely just Thessalians. And then there is a little bit of a weird festival I've plotted at Haemolion. It's not really there. You might know of it as the Septeria festival, and that's the one that's the traversion from Delphi up to there, which again isn't an agonistic festival, but it's an important festival as it's going through the Thessalian landscape, and we have ideas of cities where they stopped. Aside from the, and I have Demetrius plotted here. This will be included, I think, in the book, not in the dissertation. But for that one, it's a little bit later on, so there is a more Panhellenic festival that arises in that region called the Koinon Magnesion. And that one, it seems that we have victors from outside. But predominantly, a lot of the Thessalian festivals are a lot more regional and even local in nature. And for a lot of these festivals, we don't get ethnics associated with them. You purely get just the names. So a lot of the research that I do on that has to do a lot more with networks of people and looking at how people are related, because we don't actually know where a lot of them are from. So I have to look at a lot of the comparisons of names around Thessaly, basically.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this really interesting insight into festival and agonistic cultures in what is a really fascinating region. And I'm going to be boring and ask about Olympia and Panhellenic festivals. So just to get a bit of a context, first, how good are Thessalians in sports? So how do their victories compare to other similarly populous regions? Do we have an idea? And then the second question would be, how unique is the pattern that we see where they focus on equestrian, sort of sending representatives who are good at particularly equestrian competitions? Do we see in that era of globalization the similar kind of specialization that we see in modern Olympic Games, where certain regions or nations go for specific types of competition. So, yeah, 2 questions in one.
No, I'll try to get to all of them. So, I mean, to answer that last part first, I mean, we definitely see during this time period, and that has a lot to do actually with the research that my supervisors Anno and Christina did before our project, about how during this time period athletes become this big global phenomenon. They're traveling around the Mediterranean, so you do get victors who are winning at various different festivals, and that's kind of where these victor lists pop up. You get people mentioned as won at the Olympics 6 times or whatever, and won at the Nemean this many times. And so from Thessaly, we get a few repeat victors, but I think the only big name ones are these 2 brothers, Aegeus and Telemachus, who are seen on the Daukos monument in Delphi. And so with that monument that was implemented by the Thessalians, for those 2 brothers, there is an inscription that lists they won, I believe, 3 times, and for both of them, they win at the same games every time, 3 times at the Olympics, 2 times at the Nemean, 3 times at the Isthmian, or some sort of numbers like that. And so they're kind of the big name athletes, I guess you'd say, from Thessaly, and they won most of theirs in the combat sport events like Pancration. When it comes to a lot of the equestrian ones, it gets interesting because although I don't believe there's any repeat equestrian victors, what we do get in different Epinician odes and such is that Thessalian horses are used by other people. And so there is one ode that mentions a Thessalian horse that won at 4 consecutive Olympics. And so at this period, like, Thessalians still are renowned for their horses. We get names of horses that are winning events, and not necessarily the riders who are winning the events for some of them. And so kind of to summarize your point, I mean, the Thessalians do have some seemingly dominant victories. I can't remember the name, but there's a very prominent winner in Pancration who was known for his strength all over the Greek world, and he kind of has all these myths associated with him, and he ends up dying because he thinks he's too strong for his own good and tries to lift up a cave that's collapsing on him. And so, you know, you get these grandiose stories about some of them, but we don't really have, from Thessaly at least, any monumental victor that's winning time after time after time. Hopefully that answered all of your questions.
I was wondering about the comparison between sort of other regions of Greece, sort of like how Thessalians relative to other regions fare in the Olympic Games. Just to go back to the first.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
So for that one, not entirely sure. For a lot of my project, I've been focusing a lot more on the regional aspects. There's another colleague of mine, Tom Britton, who focuses a lot more on the grandiose aspect, but at least from this, what we do see is, I mean, Thessalians are competing around the Mediterranean. Within my dissertation, I look at other Panhellenic festivals as well. So, I mean, they win at the Pythian, Nemean, Isthmian. They also win at the Alexandria in Egypt. They win at some other festivals around. So, I mean, they're competing elsewhere. In terms of elitism, I mean, I think there's more, they don't seem to really be, I guess in a way, it's hard to compare them to other regions, I guess, because they're choosing when to compete and not compete, and especially when it comes to the surviving evidence, the majority of the Thessalians we have are from the Olympics, and we don't really have a lot of evidence for other festivals.
Yes.
I understand that the Macedonian conquest affected negatively those games, the Thessalian games. That's what I understood from.
I wouldn't say negatively. I think the point that I was trying to make is, I mean, the Macedonians coming in by imposing their authority on Thessaly, the
Right.
Thessalians are kind of feeling like they're losing their own Thessalian-ness. And so the Thessalians kind of choose to re-implement a Thessalian identity by creating their own festivals, by choosing to participate almost exclusively in these festivals, because what they're wanting is for the rest of the Greek world to come to them and see them as a unified region.
Right.
So it's not so much that the Macedonians are hurting the games, it's just that the Thessalians are choosing how to look into what they want.
So what was the reason for this? In other words, did the Macedonians participate in these games before the conquest or not? There was no interaction between Macedonia and Thessaly at those times.
Oh, I mean, there was interaction between Macedonia and Thessaly all over the place. I mean, with the particular sanctuary on Olympus, that one seems to be a very contested region. And that one, I mean, they implement the sanctuary, and I think that's very an antagonistic perspective because they're building it right on a border with Macedonia, but overlooking a Thessalian territory and kind of saying like, this mountain is ours, it's overlooking our territory, and like that. In terms of games, I don't believe the Macedonians participate all that much, at least in the earlier period. I could be wrong in that, though.
And last question, the city of Demetrius was built by the Macedonians?
Yeah, in 294 BC.
Thank you. Any other questions? Bien. Merci beaucoup, Adam. Thank you very much. And please join us all for a glass of wine. Thank you.
Thanks.